Scientific and Spiritual, the podcast for queer spirituality, because being queer is a spiritual path, with your host, Harley Phillips. Hey, welcome back. How's everybody doing? Let's just start by checking in with ourselves, where we're at today, and just take a moment to breathe, because today's episode is heavy. But my intention is that it challenges us to really begin or continue the unlearning process when it comes to systems of oppression. I've been trying to make this episode for weeks, and I've struggled with how to approach this, to be honest. I've wanted to take some time on the podcast to show more solidarity and support for the people of Palestine, other than just brief comments here and there. And I've been going back and forth about exactly what I wanted to say, recognizing that there has been so much unlearning that has to occur internally to even begin to speak about Palestine. And, not wanting to say the wrong thing or cause any harm or to be another white person speaking about things they have no business speaking about. But I don't believe this is a time to stay silent. It reminds me of when I was a big yoga person and my yoga teacher would say to embrace the wobbles and the shakes because that's where change happens. That's where balance lives. And so I say this recognizing that I have a lot to learn and unlearn. And I know there's other people out there that feel like this. Conversations surrounding systemic injustices and occupation of stolen lands and genocide, they're hard conversations to have, but it's a hell of a lot easier than being the ones actively experiencing the genocide. So the very least we can do is allow ourselves to feel uncomfortable. If you've listened to the podcast before, you know I love bringing history and research into the show, but I'm not the person to provide education on the unspeakable traumas and horrors the people of Palestine have faced because of years and years of colonization and occupation. It's so important that we lift up and learn from Palestinian voices. So Operation Olive Branch is a great resource, and I'll put a link in the show notes. And I'm also working on gathering educational resources, and I'll put those on my website under the resources tab as I'm compiling them. And if you have any additional resources that you'd like to share, please reach out and I'll add them so we can all learn together. So after a lot of reflection about what I wanted to say, I've decided to bring it back to what I do know, what this podcast is all about, spirituality and queerness. And so today's episode is about viewing activism from a lens of being a pillar of both spirituality and queerness. We're weaving in many elements into this episode, and honestly, we won't even begin to scratch the surface because there's just so much here. This episode, in a lot of ways, is really a reflection of what's been going on within my brain and trying to process and piece together what's been happening. And I know that if I'm feeling these ways, other people out there have to be feeling the same way too. So I thought it was important to talk about. We're packing a lot into this episode, but we'll talk about silence from the spiritual community with regard to Palestine, how queerness and spirituality go hand in hand with advocating for social justice and activism. We'll dive into systemic oppression, and I'll talk about some experiences I've had with unpacking privilege and a personal experience I had 20 years ago with an Israeli organization that I've been working through the process of processing it all. Before we get into that, I want to start with what's most important, and that is how we can help Palestinian families. My wife and I are working with the most remarkable group of people here locally in North Carolina with a grassroots initiative called Sacred Solidarity to help Palestinian families who have evacuated into Egypt. The amazing founder of Sacred Solidarity has connections within Egypt, so we're working with her trusted contacts to help provide funding for these families and individuals. The reality is that once a family has evacuated, they have a long road ahead of them. And I had no idea of this, but families are being charged thousands of dollars per person just to evacuate. So once families actually arrive in Egypt, they're often left with little, if anything at all, to secure basic needs like housing, food, and medical care. So we are in need of recurring donations to help with monthly living costs, one-time donations, anything you can offer helps, and any type of support in terms of spreading the word or getting involved. I'll post a link to the Give Butter page in the show notes, and you can always reach out to me if you have questions or would like to get involved or support Sacred Solidarity. We'd love to have your help in any way that you feel called to do so. You can find my email, my social media links, and my website all in the show notes to get in touch with me. So quite a few times on the podcast, we've talked about the polarity of the planet, right? The shadow and light. And I feel like how we've collectively responded to genocide, whether in Palestine, Sudan, Congo, or anywhere in the world really, it speaks to that polarity. So on one hand, I've been incredibly proud of the LGBTQ community for standing in solidarity with Palestine. And then on the other hand, I've been incredibly disappointed with the spiritual community for a lack of support and silence in many cases. I've been feeling really disappointed in some spiritual New Age leaders that I followed over the years that have not said a single thing about Palestine. I've heard the argument from many influencers that Palestine or politics isn't their niche, so they don't feel equipped to talk about it. But if you are a spiritual influencer, right, a spiritual author, coach, whatever that may be, with a following, I'd say this actually is your niche. Healing's your niche. And the world needs healing now more than ever. I've watched so many people who I've entrusted with my growth and respected their wisdom, who have built a platform off of healing, say nothing. In dark times, people look toward their teachers, their mentors for guidance. And when those who hold power and influence say nothing, it creates ripple effects of silence out into the collective. At the heart of spirituality, there is this pursuit for connection with something greater than yourself. This is a part of that connection. Let's take it back to that idea of oneness, that we're all connected. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "No one is free until we all are free." And I've heard the counter argument to this. What could influential spiritual people actually do to help? An Instagram post of support for Palestine isn't going to change anything. And I hear you, but it's a place to start. Influencers influence by definition. So if you have a big following and you post something about what's happening in Palestine, you may have actually just woken someone up to what's going on. You can use your influence to fundraise, to provide education, to create a container to hold this pain, to share wisdom and encouragement. You could hold global meditations that focus on ending genocide because there is power in numbers and collective vision. There is. And also, it's about walking the talk. I was furious with this one woman who I follow, or I used to follow, I should say, on social media, who posted something the other day that said, "Turn off the news, it's lowering your vibration." I'm sorry, what? I'm sorry that the news and genocide are killing your high vibe. It's not about tuning out the problems of the world or only focusing on the positives. It's about learning how to maintain that high vibrational energy within darkness, bringing it to the darkness. Remember, we can only see the beauty and radiance of your light in the contrast of darkness. I remember when I was growing up, one of the neighborhood kids had those glow-in-the-dark stars all over their ceiling, and I was always so mesmerized by them. How with the lights on, they were just these regular, quite frankly, tacky-looking stars on the ceiling. But when the lights were turned off, they came alive. They glowed. They were captivating to me. Lightworkers, same concept applies. By turning off the lights, by being in darkness, it's what activates your light. It shines at its fullest luminosity. It's what others look to in the dark. You won't ever shine your brightest if you only surround yourself with light. So it doesn't matter how high vibe you can be if you're not using it for what it's intended for, which is to light the way for others, to help heal the planet, right? Spiritual practices are sacred, and they're not just here for us to manifest a dream car or more money. That's a brand of spirituality that has been infiltrated by capitalism. The lack of responsiveness has had me questioning the authenticity of many spiritual influencers. And I say this from a place of genuinely feeling misled and confused. And look, I understand everyone's going to show up differently. But I'm talking about if you have a large platform and you've grown that platform off of the premise that your mission is to be a healer, to provide spiritual support to the masses, and you're not saying anything at all about Palestine, yeah, I believe we as consumers of your content should 100% be questioning your legitimacy. What irks me is that for years, I've been hearing people with great reach and influence within the spiritual community talk about the planet ascending into this higher vibrational frequency of love and healing and community with the astrological shift from the Piscean age to the age of Aquarius. What happens is that every 2,160 years or so, we enter into a new astrological age. And some astrologers will say that we entered into the age of Aquarius in 2012, while others say 2020 or 2021, and others say we still have upward of 500 years until we even enter into this new age. But nevertheless, we've been hearing about this jump from the Piscean age to the age of Aquarius and the significance that this change will bring in terms of shifting from a me to we consciousness. So operating collectively for the greater good and shifting from an individual mindset to group mentality. The Piscean age was about duality, and we are breaking out of that duality as we move into the age of Aquarius. That astrological shift, that time for change, it's here. Or it has the potential to be here if we choose to work with the energies of change that are available to us. But that requires action. The point I'm making here is that for years I've listened to and watched spiritual influencers talk about raising the collective consciousness and dismantling patriarchy and reclaiming the divine feminine and bringing the goddess back to our consciousness. And to me, it's like, here we are. Watching genocide before our very eyes is really the direct result of all of the things I've heard the spiritual community shun. Patriarchy, a lack of the feminine, etc., and nothing. Crickets. You say you want to end patriarchy, but I don't believe you anymore because you're benefiting from it. Do you only care about dismantling patriarchy if it only has to do with issues that directly impact you? I don't understand. Make it make sense. But what I've learned from all of this recently is that it actually does make perfect sense. Because when you combine spirituality and capitalism, this is what you get when money holds more weight than humanity. A big part of the issue here is when capitalism and spirituality come together, things get complicated. The message can get tainted. And it leads us to this question of what is ethical spirituality? There's been so many times I've been really inspired by someone's message, and then I'll go check out whatever course it is they're offering, and it's like $3,000, and I'm like, who the fuck can afford this? It's so easy to say it's an investment in you, and the universe will provide if you align with the experiences you're meant for, but let's be real. That's easier said than done when most Americans are struggling financially to get by. So then who benefits? Only people with privilege. And you hear sometimes this rhetoric of like, make an investment in yourself and you'll be rewarded. Like, make it happen and it will just align. But that comes across as preying on the vulnerable. I don't see it any different than a church telling its congregation to tithe and that they'll be blessed tenfold or something. It's predatory. Who's benefiting from capitalistic spirituality? Who even has access to it? Healing practices should not be a commodity to be bought and sold for only those with privilege to be able to access the tools. And I know that there's people out there who offer scholarships and reduced rates, and that is so needed. So thank you so much for seeing these issues. And it's one way to begin to navigate these disparities in terms of access to healing work. But I think we have a long way to go to make healing accessible to everyone and not just people with money. And the harsh current reality is that we're living in a capitalistic system. So even though we know these systems are harming us and need to be changed, how do we pay our bills in the meantime? So I get it. Until things change, we need money. Healers need money. Spiritual coaches need money. Everyone needs money under this system. And anyone in any type of healing or human service profession, whether it's spiritual or not, whether it's another helping profession like nursing, teaching, therapy, we've historically been undervalued and underpaid for our skills and services. So I do want to honor the struggle of trying to navigate how do I make my services accessible to all while still being able to survive financially. And I don't have an answer to this. It's a part of the function of the system, right? To keep it so we stay stuck in the cycle of hopelessness and then we'll never escape it. And speaking of therapy, who has access to therapy? I worked in the mental health field for 11 years, 8 of those as a therapist. And I can say from experience that the people who need the most amount of care either aren't getting it or are being severely underserved, with most who are struggling with access to care being marginalized populations. If you've ever tried to find a competent therapist who takes Medicaid or without financial resources, how did that work for you? Because the truth is, access to quality mental health therapy is reserved for those with privilege in the US, just like most things within the healthcare system. There came a time when I was a therapist desperately in need of my own therapy, and yet I couldn't afford it because I had no healthcare working for myself, and I couldn't afford the marketplace plans, and all of the therapy I had over the years went on credit cards, creating more problems because how do we expect people's mental health to really improve when they're stressed over how they're going to pay for it? And to be really real, I haven't returned to the field since I left due to autistic burnout for these reasons, because I feel this ethical dilemma when it comes to mental health therapy, because the field was literally founded on the very values and ideologies that I'm trying to resist and change. And I just feel like I was a part of the problem. And in no way am I anti-therapy because it is so important. It saves lives. Even if the system is broken, it's one of the only resources we have, and people need support. And there are incredible and caring and competent therapists out there with pure intentions and the biggest of hearts. But I just got to a place where I couldn't see past the fact that there is a lot of privilege that comes with therapy. There is a lot of behavior training to mold individuals to what society deems as appropriate. There's oftentimes a lack of attention to the systems that are keeping people stuck. And then there's the fact that the DSM, the book we use to categorize and diagnose people in order for insurance companies to profit, really, is written by white men, with most of what they consider to be pathology really just a lack of adhering to social norms or direct stress as a result of the systems that we live in. I have a master's degree in social work, and the origin of social work is one that is filled with racism and colonialism. The National Association of Social Workers, or the NASW, published an apology in 2021 after the murder of George Floyd, acknowledging that the field of social work has supported policies and actions that have directly harmed people of color. And here's just a few acknowledgments that the NASW has made in terms of harm that the profession of social work has caused. So social workers participated in the removal of Indigenous children from their families and placement in boarding schools. Social workers also took part in intake teams at Japanese internment camps during World War II. Social workers helped recruit Black men into the Tuskegee experiment, which, if you're not familiar, this was an absolutely horrific and inhumane study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and it aimed to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in Black men under the guise of providing free healthcare. However, none of the participants were told they had syphilis, and they didn't treat it. They let the study participants suffer, and they never once disclosed the purpose of the study to the participants. They never offered them the option to withdraw from the study. And as a result, many participants suffered severe health issues, including blindness, mental health struggles, and even death. And it took a journalist to expose what was happening, which led to public outrage for the experiments to end, 40 years after the experiments began. So to bring it back to spirituality, how do we trust these forms of healing? Whether it's spiritual or mental health therapy, when capitalism and colonialism, all the isms, are currently so intertwined with them. These are questions bigger than this podcast, bigger than me, bigger than you, but we've got to start somewhere. And I think recognizing that issues exist, it's a good place to start. The problem we historically run into is that we lose momentum with movements. We burn out, we feel defeated, and we fall back into the habit of doing things how we've always done them because the resistance to our resistance is so strong. So I think it's important to remember we're in this for the long haul when it comes to working to change these systems. This is the work of a lifetime and then some. So we just have to keep moving forward and take care of ourselves and each other in the process, not losing sight of why we're advocating for change in the first place. And for the here and now, That might just be about the most spiritual thing any of us can do, is to commit to consciously separating ourselves from the brainwash we've all been under with regard to colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, and to act in ways that we're capable of to help bring about change. And I know this is really hard work. We can't ignore the fact that here in the US, we're also living on occupied land. We can't ignore the fact that 56 million indigenous people were killed in just about 100 years in North and South America as a result of colonization. And if you're white, we're the descendants of that. And, it's not your direct fault, but it is our sacred responsibility to unlearn and work to repair the harm that our ancestors caused, to do our part to heal these karmic wounds, and to listen to and respect indigenous people. So something I've been reflecting on a lot lately is the fact that trauma and systemic oppression are two different things. And it literally took me coming out of the closet to really see that. I'm going to call myself out here and hold myself accountable for some problematic thinking I had years ago. So I was in grad school for my MSW when Trump won the presidential election in 2016. So obviously being in a graduate level social work program at the University of Michigan, we would be having a lot of conversations about the election and the implications for social work, for our clients, for policy. I didn't truly understand how harmful the system was at the time. You can't learn systemic oppression from a textbook. You can intellectualize it, but you can't really get it, I remember there was a particular class I was taking, and the class was about treating substance use in adolescent populations. Well, during the election, we talked a lot about the election and not always substance use. I remember telling my advisor casually during a meeting that I enjoyed the class, but I was really hoping to learn more about how to actually treat substance misuse. What I was completely missing was the fact that the results of the election tied into treating substance use in terms of funding and policy and access to care, and also the fact that mental health and substance misuse were likely going to rise under a Trump presidency. People use substances to cope, and being an oppressed person under a Trump administration, I'd say that caused a lot of stress, which could in turn then lead to a rise in substance use. So this was so relevant and so important, and I didn't see it. Then there was a day in the same class that election conversations got real. Classmates of mine that were people of color and LGBTQ were getting emotional, sharing their fear about a Trump presidency and what that would mean for their lives. Keep in mind, I wasn't out yet. And not only was I not out, I was engaged to a man and living the most privileged portion of my life. I remember trying to chime in and brought up relating in some way due to trauma, and a classmate called me out on it, rightfully so, basically telling me that I didn't get it, that I wasn't listening. And what did I do? Instead of listening to my classmate, I didn't really hear them out. I argued that I did get it, and I played the victim in my mind. And I remember going home and complaining to my fiance at the time how everyone was so mean to me. Look, I did a lot of things wrong here. One, I minimized the experiences of my BIPOC and LGBTQ classmates by trying to throw my stuff into the mix as a person of privilege. Two, I failed to be really open to hearing out my classmates and instead chose to play the victim. So by default, I made the space unsafe and I prevented growth from happening. And also, I was incredibly privileged to attend the University of Michigan School of Social Work, a program that is consistently ranked the #1 school of social work in the US. So talk about a moment of wasting a privilege, of closing myself off from receiving knowledge from such brilliant minds. I feel embarrassed for how I acted, but I wanted to talk about it because I think we need to be accountable, and that starts with holding ourselves accountable. That was 8 years ago. A lot has happened. I've changed. I've grown. And I'm at a place where I can recognize how brainwashed I was by the system and how much I didn't see because I wasn't being directly impacted by it at the time. And I think a lot of people, a lot of white people in particular, we think this way. I did. I was ignorant. We don't fully understand something until it impacts us. I ignorantly thought I could relate because I've experienced a lot of trauma in my life. I thought I was relating with my pain, but what I wasn't seeing or understanding is that the pain was sourced differently. Because even with the odds stacked against me, even living a life that was far from easy, even surviving just about every possible type of abuse you could think of interpersonally, I still never had to worry about where my next meal was coming from, or if my rights would be stripped away, or if I would be denied the same level of respect and the same opportunities because of my skin color. I didn't understand the layers of white supremacy that were at play in all aspects of our society. I used to think like, well, if I can go from being an orphaned high school dropout to someone with a master's degree, anyone can do it. But could they really? Because if I wasn't a bubbly blonde white woman, things would have been harder. There would have been more hoops to jump through to come out the other side. And that's just the truth. And then I came out as a lesbian. And then my disability started to actually disable me to the point that I couldn't work. And then I experienced a loss of income, a drop in social class, lack of resources, lack of health care. And that's when the blinders started coming off. Because now, as a queer disabled woman, I was no longer who this system was built for. I can see clearly now that patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, as white people, we make at times this unconscious agreement with these systems where it's like, you protect me, and in turn, I'll play by your rules. And when we stop playing by the rules, we lose that protection. We adhere to the system for safety until we realize the foundation of safety was built on a pile of sand. And still, I want to acknowledge that white privilege still benefits me. And I am not trying to act as though I'll ever understand the unique experiences and struggles of the BIPOC communities. They have had to endure the greatest amount of suffering at the hands of the patriarchy, and there's just no arguing that. The system was designed to keep white people, specifically white men, in positions of power, and we can't deny the racial component to systems of oppression. The fact that it took me experiencing oppression myself as a queer disabled woman to even start to see the truth of how systemic oppression works says everything to how gaslit we are as white people into believing this system is actually good for us. Coming out was a wake-up call for me to what's actually happening in the world. And I think the reason myself and so many others remained closeted for so long is because there's a part of us that understands that coming out and breaking ties with heteronormativity means we lose our standing in the system. We're afraid to experience hate and oppression, and so we let the system win and we stay hidden until we feel safe enough to come out. I was watching one of those Jubilee middle ground YouTube shows recently where people with different beliefs debate, and this episode was called The Hidden Cost of Coming Out. And it was openly queer people versus closeted queer people. And all of the closeted queer people hid their faces for protection, which speaks to safety for queer people in the US right now. But one of the things I found most interesting is that a few of the closeted queer people talked about wanting to come out, but waiting to do so until they had saved enough money to be able to financially support themselves, knowing that they were going to be cut off from their Christian families. So Christian, to shun your children, isn't it? Anyway, that says it all, right? So sometimes we have to actively plan how to safely be ourselves, how to safely leave the system. And it has so much power over us and how we choose to live our lives, and even if we can live our lives as ourselves. And this is why queer people are standing with Palestine. Over the weekend, my wife and I did a 5K that was organized by a local Palestinian-owned deli, and you would have thought there was also a pride event going on because there were so many queer people who showed up to run and to support the cause, and there were plenty of pride flags mixed in with Palestinian flags. And it was just so beautiful to see such a diverse group of people come together to show solidarity for Palestine. It honestly gave me so much hope, and I felt like I was witnessing a glimpse of truly what we could be as a society, of people just showing up for each other despite differences because of this human thread that links us all together, the humanity in all of us. Queer people show up to take a stand against oppression of any kind because we know what it's like to be marginalized, to have rights denied, to be hated for just existing, to live in fear of being yourself out in public. Growing up in a devoutly Catholic household and then being rebaptized later on in life as an evangelical, and knowing the lies and brainwash and hate I was fed about LGBTQ people, about myself, it's painful. Because queer people are actually out in the world doing true humanitarian work. God's work, if you will, if that's what you want to call it. Queer people are doing so much good in the world, time and time again, showing up for whoever it is that needs support. And I'm just so proud to be a part of this community. And we do this work because we've always had to do it historically. We had to become advocates for ourselves, and so we learned to become advocates for others as well. We understand that in order to live in a truly free world, everyone must be able to share in these same freedoms. The very reason I was able to marry my wife is because of queer activists. All of those who came before us have fought so hard and faced more adversity than many of us can comprehend to ensure we have rights today. And now it's our turn. Our rights are on the line again because of the same patriarchal system of hate that is responsible for the genocide in Gaza and colonization around the world. I wanted to talk about queer activists in this episode, but this episode is already getting pretty long, and I want to allow for enough time to really dive deep. So in an upcoming episode, we'll return to this and celebrate and explore activism specifically within the LGBTQ community. So be on the lookout for that during Pride Month. And I know there's people who will say, try being gay in a Muslim country and see how that works for you. And to that I say, do you really think Christians are much better? Have you paid attention to what's happening in our own country with regard to LGBTQ rights and hate? And also, this isn't about religion. This is about life and death, right and wrong. This is about children being starved to death and at least 36,000 people, many of which being children, being killed in a 7-month period of time. If you follow me on TikTok, you may have already heard me talk about this before, but my wife is Jewish, non-practicing. She's just as much of a witch as I am. And, we celebrate Hanukkah for the cultural and family aspect. But other than that, we don't have any ties to the Jewish community. But my wife is the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. Her great-grandfather worked for the Hungarian government. And despite Kelly's grandfather being like, we need to leave, this is getting bad, people are being sent to concentration camps, her great-grandfather believed he would be protected because he had a government job. Kelly's grandfather was able to escape, but her great-grandparents and other family members were killed in Auschwitz. Having this family connection, my wife, my sister-in-law, being descendants of Holocaust survivors is part of what makes them so vocal about doing their part to help Palestine and to end genocide because they know the cost of this. We said never again after the Holocaust, and here we are. It's complete and utter brainwash to claim that being pro-Palestine or anti-Zionist is being anti-Semitic. Being anti-Zionist is being against occupation of stolen land, not being against Jewish people. A book written 3,500 years ago gives no one authority over land. No different than the fact that that same book should not be able to dictate any political decisions whatsoever. It's propaganda. And speaking of propaganda, I've been reflecting and unpacking an experience I had in high school with an Israeli organization, and I'm still processing it all, so we'll see where it leads, but I feel like it's important to talk about. So when I was in high school, I was in a club at my school that used theater to talk about issues teens were facing. And it was really a wonderful experience. We wrote scripts and we performed plays together about our lives, the issues that were impacting us. And it was amazing. So this group joined forces with an Israeli group called Peace Child Israel. And as teens, we were told that we would be hosting, and again, this is how it was expressed to us, the exact language, Arab Israeli and Jewish Israeli teens to help use theater to promote peace in Israel. Like most 15-year-olds, I had absolutely no context of what was happening in Israel. No idea of the history. I grew up outside of Philly in an area with little diversity where pretty much everyone was white and some sort of Italian or Irish descent. And this was also in 2006, so 5 years after September 11th. And around that time, you have to remember there was massive Islamophobia happening in the US. So basically, we were told that we'd be helping to showcase that Jewish teens and Muslim teens in a place like Israel could come together and be friends and that we would help inspire people. And I was so excited about this project, about being able to be a part of it. We were pen pals with these kids before they even arrived in the US, so there was excitement, and I felt like I had already known them in some way. So they were in the US for about 2 weeks, I think, and during that time, we performed together all around the New Jersey, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York area, and I was asked to be the English-speaking MC of their performance at the National Constitution Center in Philly, and there were politicians there, and it was a big deal, and I felt like, wow, like I'm really doing something important and special in the world. Truly, this experience was life-changing for me. All of the kids, they were like 15 in total. They were just incredible. The Israeli kids spoke English, but the Palestinian kids, or the Arabic kids, as they called them, they didn't. So actually at that time, my Spanish was much better than it is today. And some spoke Spanish, so we actually communicated together in Spanish. And when they first arrived in the US, I remember them briefly going over the conflict in Israel, as they called it. And one thing now looking back that I find so wrong is the word Palestine was never once spoken. It was always Arab Israeli or Muslim Israeli, but these kids were Palestinian. They had their translator tell us about the Nakba, about their family homes being taken. I remember one of my Palestinian friends telling me about how his grandmother still wore her key around her neck, waiting for the day she could return home. But somehow the word Palestine never came up. How can you talk about the Nakba without talking about Palestine? We're beating around the bush. It's very clear to me now, as kids, we weren't being told the entire truth. And these kids told us about how, despite living very close to each other, they went to different schools, that outside of this group, they didn't even know anyone else from the other side, if you will. And I remember at the time they were telling us that they went to different schools, and I thought that was odd, because even then it sounded like segregation. But they never called it that. One of my favorite movies growing up was The Color of Friendship on the Disney Channel, the movie about the South African exchange student who comes to live with the family of a Black U.S. senator during the Civil Rights Movement. And I remember thinking, this kind of sounds similar. And so throughout everything that has been happening, I can't stop thinking about these friends I made 20 years ago, about this experience I had, because I thought at the time it was opening my eyes to the world, but in reality, when I look back now, I feel like we were basically being used to spread propaganda. You can't say you actively are trying to promote peace when you can't even utter Palestine. You can't bring these kids together to perform for politicians and wealthy donors in America and then have them go back to their segregated schools and truly believe your mission is pure. I started researching the organization in the last few months, and what I found was disturbing. So Peace Child Israel, it ended in 2011, but I wanted to find out who was actually funding this project. I had questions, right? So I came to find out that it was funded by an organization called the Jerusalem Foundation. On their website homepage, one of the first things you see is something that says, "Your share in Jerusalem. Join us in strengthening Jerusalem, an ancient city, becoming a center for youthful creativity, innovation, inclusiveness, and pluralism. An open city functioning as the civil society capital of Israel and the Jewish people. A livable city for young families and inspiration to the world." Wow, okay. So I think it goes without me even saying just how problematic these statements are in the donation plea. Inclusive? Inclusive for who? Not the Palestinians. Also, you can't legally get married as a queer person living in Israel, so inclusive, huh? Okay. Pluralism, flat out lie. The capital of the Jewish people. So in one sentence, you say you're about inclusivity and pluralism, and then in the next, you say you're the capital of the Jewish people. Which one is it? So the Jerusalem Foundation was founded by Teddy Kollek, who was the mayor of Jerusalem from 1965 to 1993, who was nicknamed Jerusalem's greatest builder since Herod the Great. You know, the same king that the Bible tells us called for baby boys being born in Bethlehem to be killed in an attempt to kill Jesus. And he was known for killing anyone he believed to be a threat, including killing his own wife. So great person to be compared to. And I found an article that was actually published in 1993 in the Middle East Report written by Joost Hilderman, who talks about Teddy Kollek, the founder of the Jerusalem Foundation, and the former mayor of Jerusalem, and his role within his administration forcibly removing Palestinians from Jerusalem. Hilterman references Kollek's autobiography, where Kollek wrote, "Some of these were reluctant to leave, but all the Arabs in the Jewish quarter were only too happy to receive ample compensation and settle outside of the old city. They had no special feeling for the place." This man, who did and said these horrible things, his organization funded the Peace Child Israel project I was a part of as a teenager. So I don't think I'm speaking out of line when I say we were used as propaganda, because it sure seems like someone who didn't see anything wrong with displacing Palestinians from their homes would actually care about promoting peace. And it's been a hard truth to come to learn that what I thought was this groundbreaking cultural experience I had when I was 15 was really just propaganda, because we weren't being told the truth. It was presented to us like we just needed to see our similarities and everything would be fine. And as a bunch of kids, we believed it. I believed it. And I don't necessarily think everyone had bad intentions involved with the project, but intentions don't change the underlying truth that this was never about Palestinians and Israelis just not being able to get along. This is about stealing and occupying land and harming and killing so many people in the process in unimaginable ways. It's like a mission trip, you know? That's what it feels like to me now. That we could just pat ourselves on the back for doing great work, when in reality, we were just another part of the problem, causing even more harm. Okay. This was a lot. This episode was heavy. The world is heavy. But I hope these reflections I've been pondering affirm or validate or help in some way. And again, please, if you're able to donate to Sacred Solidarity to help recently evacuated Palestinian families in Egypt, check out the link in the show notes. And if you follow me on social media, on TikTok or Instagram at Sapphic and Spiritual, you'll see the link in my bio. And it's also on my website at www.sapphicanspiritual.com. All right, I love you all. Thank you truly for listening. And I appreciate you all so much. And I'll see you next week.